Hey, I'm Scott.
And I'm Chris.
And this is Doxalogic, where we help you think with your Bible.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Doxalogic. Scott, how you doing, man?
Doing well, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing...
I love these days.
Yes.
When we get
Same.
To have an amazing guest on our show.
Yes, absolutely. We've been honored to have a variety of guests on our show, and today will be no different. We're honored to have Dr. Joe Rigney on the show today. Dr. Rigney, appreciate you coming on. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. We have been working with your assistant for some time on this, and very much appreciate it. I know you have been on a tour of a lot of calls and all this with couple of books in particular that have come out recently, and we're going to get to one of those called Leadership and Emotional Sabotage in just a little bit. But
what a title, by the way.
Oh, I know.
What
right?
a title.
The title and the graphic is so good.
So
you had to be
good.
proud of that.
Right.
Oh, man.
That was. Did you draw that yourself, by the way?
I did not. That's all. Canon did all of that, and
Yeah.
they know what they're doing. Let's just put it.
Yes, they do.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we could start here. There's, I'm sure, a lot more background we could cover, but you recently journeyed from Bethlehem College and Seminary, right, as the president of the seminary, to Moscow, Idaho, to New St. Andrews and Christ Church, and maybe just give us a little, I don't know, the last year or so personal journey and how the Lord led you to where you are from Bethlehem Seminary.
Yeah, for sure. So my wife and I had been in Bethlehem for about 18 years. We're originally from Texas. She was born and raised Houston. I was born and raised West Texas. Met at Texas A&M and then got married right before we went north to Bethlehem. I was a student there, a professor there for a number of years, and then became president in 2021, I believe. And basically, kind of what happened is for years I've been I've been post-millennial. I've taught political philosophy and I was a little bit of an unusual Baptist, I would say. I would regularly call myself a magisterial Baptist, by which I meant, in terms of political philosophy, was much more akin to Calvin and the other reformers in that regard, over against kind of more modern Baptistic political philosophy. And part of what happened was kind of a substantive disagreement about political philosophy, really as the sort of Christian nationalism conversation came online. I'd been teaching courses on political philosophy at Bethlehem for a number of years, but as that Christian nationalism conversation got going, I was getting asked to speak at various places and on that subject, doing panels and talking through that sort of thing. And it became basically clear that there was a substantive difference between me and some of the other key leaders at Bethlehem. And we sought to work it out, tried to get clarity. And, the more that we pursued that clarity, the bigger the divide got. It didn't dial things down. It kind of dialed them up as, oh no, we really are in different places. And so that was a pretty substantive issue, especially because that issue was kind of high profile. And I think the question was in my judgment, leaning in on that conversation was a wise and good thing. It's a live question. Questions of social order and politics are live ones for a lot of churches, especially post-COVID and some of the post-work stuff, right, and where the new, negative world. And so I was wanting to lean in, but to do so as the president sort of represented the institution in a particular way. And some leaders were like, well, we don't really know if we want that to be kind of the front and center identifying marker of Bethlehem. It's not historically necessarily been that. And so it was kind of like, as the president, am I a good fit for this season? And basically through that kind of realized, I think it would be better for me to step down and to, basically go someplace where I can lean in on these issues if I want, and that I might be a better fit in terms of my overall perspective. And so as a result, I resigned from the presidency and took a role out here in Moscow, kind of towards the tail end of that process too. Some of the questions of baptism kind of were put on the table again with fresh eyes. Basically, I'd kind of settled the Baptist question years and years ago, but as what I would call a soft Baptist. I was saw a lot of merit in the other view, but held to credo baptism. And then as my political philosophy and some of those things kind of got more firmed up, then I kind of reopened that, and it was like, oh, okay, I'm seeing some connections here. And so that also kind of that was kind of the straw that kind of broke the camel's back in terms of, being able to stay was that became an open question. It's since kind of, I've tipped into the Paedo Baptist camp. And so all of that kind of cluster of issues was kind of what led to it. And, I'm grateful for the time that I had at Bethlehem. I'm really, pleased and proud of the school that was, I get to be a part of. It's an amazing thing to be, fresh out of seminary and yet asked to kind of help build a school. And so the experience I got there, the friendships and with my colleagues and so forth, was a really sweet time. Loved that we planted a church, there as a pastor for about 7 years. So all kinds of really sweet, great memories and friendships still with the folks there. But it was God called us to make a transition. And so we've been out here now for almost 10 months.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was thinking about, there's been a relationship between you and Doug Wilson for a while, because I go back to thinking about that first episode of Man Rampant, which was about the sin of empathy, and that stirred up its own firestorm.
Yes,
within a small, pocket of more conservative evangelicalism, I would imagine, and maybe even beyond that, So maybe give us a little bit into that dynamic, that relationship, and how that has developed, because a lot of what you guys are doing has been really helpful and useful.
Yeah. So, I've for years, I was kind of this middle ground, I suppose is one way to put it, combination. I think in one of my early books, The Things of Earth, I talked about it as a kind of a fusion of a couple of different streams. Jonathan Edwards and C.S. Lewis were the dead guys that fed into it, but then John Piper and Doug Wilson were the living streams that fed into that. And so, for a number of years, Doug would come out and speak at our conference. John came out here once and spoke at Grace Agenda, and I was kind of the one who was like really fascinated by what I saw as like an amazing unity on some of the big theological sorts of issues, sovereignty of God, supremacy of God in all things, and that sort of thing. But also just the pretty distinct differences between the philosophy of ministry, the personality and things like that between Doug and John, both of whom I have great regard for. And so, I've done a couple of interviews about a decade or so, maybe more than that now, between the two of them, where I, was just the young guy kind of throwing up, well, you say this and you say that and you say this and you say that. And those were fantastic. But then, as you mentioned in 2018 or so, this is actually where the part of my new book came from. I had been really helped by a book by a guy named Edwin Friedman, called A Failure of Nerve. I'd read it probably back in 2013 or so. And I can't remember if I gave it to Doug or if Doug gave it to me, but it was one of those, so basically we had kind of had this bond. Oh, this is really helpful. This is a really great book. And then, one of the things that Friedman highlights is he's talking about the failure of nerve among leaders. And one of the dangers is what he calls the fallacy of empathy, where sort of the fundamental leadership trait and virtue is to sort of dive into people's pain and everything. And his argument was, no, actually in the modern world, empathy is a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. It's a mask for social anxiety, and kind of an anxious reactive system. And in the name of empathy, we coddle and accommodate the most reactive members of our communities, and they're able to hijack and set the agenda. So he was arguing this. He was writing in the 90s, pre-internet, about this sort of stuff. And I just found that really illuminating. And then it was basically like the next 10 years conspired to just prove him right. And so
time and time again.
Yeah, exactly. As you're watching things unfold, both in terms of the culture, wider, American society, as
social
well
media,
as within the church, there was this, oh man, he's really onto something. And the challenge is that Friedman was he was a Jewish rabbi, a psychological, really, family therapist. So a lot of his categories were psychological categories, therapeutic categories, and evolutionary categories. He was a staunch evolutionist, and really that was deeply embedded in the way he talked about all this stuff. And so I was finding, as I was teaching on this, or I would talk to other pastors who were dealing with things, and hey, I've got these categories that were really helpful. I was always having to translate. And so one of the things that actually the sin of empathy is a good example of, he talks about the fallacy of empathy. He talks about the danger of empathy. And then I decided, no, we're going to call it the sin of empathy. So this isn't the psychological category. Let's use Bible words, sin. And that's part of what made people erupt, was certain people couldn't fathom the idea of empathy being a sin. That was just it was like a contradiction in terms. And so some of that controversy, which kind of flares up, I would say, every few years. For a while, it was like clockwork. Like once a year, somebody was going to read that or watch that. I wrote a number of articles, so they'd read something I wrote or watch that video, and it would just do it again. And it was always, for me, it was an opportunity. Oh, great, I get to write about this again. Let me clarify something else. Let me add something else to the discussion. And so that's been kind of a wild ride. But feel even more. I didn't realize when we did it. It was the first episode of Man Rampant. I didn't realize when we did it what we were doing. I was, hey, let's do this. Let's talk. You and I like Friedman. We like Gerard. Let's talk sin of empathy. Great. We do it. And then again, like the last 5 years have really sort of solidified that I think we were over the target.
Yeah, and you've continued to clarify this issue, and it's been really helpful because it's almost like a discipleship process taking place for the church through this developing conversation. So the Lord has seen fit to have these like firestorms that keep coming up over years actually help to understand this whole idea better and get away from the freak out response that is so typical and really lean into what you're saying. And I think one of the more recent terms that you've used is empathy that's untethered. Right?
Yes.
As that's the idea that you're specifically leaning into and saying is a problem, is a dominant problem in our culture, and you definitely see it in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I can't remember. It may have been Piper who clarified it that way. It may have been my friend, actually, Abigail Dodds, who at one point was writing on a similar thing and mentioned the phrase untethered. And I thought, oh, that's a really good way to put it. And so since then, when I've wanted to be most precise, that's the term I've used. And yet I would say part of the reason to use even just the generic sin of empathy is the untethered version likes to hide behind noble things. Like,
it's the people they want to make a synonym out of compassion and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And they don't have a good biblical framework for what compassion actually looks like, but they're going to make a synonym with empathy. And then when you insist that it's not the same thing, or there's boundaries around what empathy actually ought to do in a godly person, ought to look like, that's when, to use a not biblical word, but a trigger, right?
Yeah,
for
right.
so many people is to even, it's like the sacred cow idea or being right over the target. It's like when you see that reaction, a nerve, right, has been touched.
And, and it's actually interesting because it's not just, I think this is part of the confusion is what does compassion mean? What does empathy mean? How do they relate to one another? But in a lot of cases, people actually view empathy as a superior. It's like compassion 2.0.
Yes.
It's not just that it's a synonym.
It's the better version.
It's the better version. And
Yeah.
what makes it better for a lot of folks is that compassion can be a little judgy. Right. So compassion or sympathy, those are synonyms in Bible terms.
Right.
But those are things where, there's someone who's hurting and there's someone who's trying to help, but that assumes a kind of asymmetry. One of us is sinking in quicksand and one of us isn't. And the one who isn't is going to try to help you get out of the quicksand. But that sort of judgment, right, that evaluation, that even emotional distance that compassion sort of presumes was regarded as a problem by some folks. So sympathy was kind of taken as a part of what I was responding to was folks who were acting like the sin of sympathy. They were
Right.
talking. They were implicitly saying the sin of sympathy. Sympathy is not as caring of a response. It's not as loving of a response. And what we really need is to dial it up with empathy. And I was pushing back on that dial up because it was actually losing something essential to the biblical virtue, which is this idea of being tethered or governed by what is true and what is good, not simply getting lost in the emotions, feelings, and pain of other people.
Yeah.
So not jumping into the quicksand with them.
Exactly. Don't jump in with both feet. If you're going to help, you've got to be tethered to something on the shore. You've got to have an arm on a branch. You've got to have 1 foot at least on the shore, and then you can reach in. If you're tethered, you can reach in and you can actually do some good. That was I think that when I think about some critics, I think some of them were well intentioned in the migration they were doing with empathy. They were resisting what they would regard as kind of an apathy, an uncaring. I'm not even going to help. I'm just going to stand on the shore and watch you drown. And they didn't want to do that. And it was sort of a fall to the other extreme. So jump in with both feet. No, we want to be tethered both to the hurt, the one who's hurt, as well as to Christ, as well as to the truth. And both of those tetherings are important. And it's been really interesting, even as things have gone on. I run across, I thought I learned most of this from Friedman, which I did, but I didn't realize how much I learned from this from C.S. Lewis. So Lewis, he talks about this, and Chesterton both talk about. Chesterton uses the phrase untruthful pity. Right, the modern virtues have become separated from each other. Pity, for many humanitarians, their pity has become separated from the truth, and it's untruthful. So untruthful pity, that's just untethered empathy in another form. And then Lewis has a great section where he talks about even a virtue like pity, when separated, he says, when separated from honesty and charity, leads through anger to cruelty. Pity leads through anger to cruelty. When does it do that? Well, when it's separated from justice and charity and the moral law, in other words, when it's untethered. And so Lewis describes that in prose. He displays it in a number of his books. Great Divorce, most especially, is a big theme in that book is the passion of pity and the way that it's used to blackmail people. And so I learned, I think I just absorbed a bunch of this from Lewis, and it came out in terms of the empathy thing, because that wasn't a word that people used in his day. But this is an older critique that I'm just reviving at a moment when the world is awash in a sea of feelings and everybody's getting swept away.
Yeah. So the book title again, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, and the subtitle, Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World. So how Joe, how does anxiety accomplish this much?
Yes. Yeah. So the word anxiety there is a term that actually is a Friedman term. And what he means by anxiety, we think of anxiety as like a personal, individual, I'm worried about something. I'm anxious. And that's part of its meaning. He actually means like an anxious system, and a systemic anxiety, what he calls a chronic anxiety, which is an atmosphere of reactivity. And the biblical term for this is one of the translation things I've been engaged in, is passions. He says reactivity. The Bible term for this is passions. So when people are governed by their passions, by their immediate impulsive sort of reactions to stuff, and those reactions vary. So one passion, desire is a passion. You see something, you immediately want it. Anger is a passion. You see something, you want it, and somebody gets in the way. That makes you angry. So that's a passion. Fear is a passion. Sadness could be a passion. Pity is a passion. So these passions are often our immediate reactions, snap reactions to reality, and they want to lead. But God designed them as good things that needed to be governed. So we need all of those emotions, we would call them emotions, Bible calls them passions, need to be governed by what we know to be true and what we know to be good. And so our minds need to rule our passions, and God needs to rule over all of us. And so when Friedman talks about anxiety, he means a system where I would say the passions are churning. You have these anxiety storms. These could be a rage storm, could be a sadness storm, could be a fear storm, could be a pity storm, an empathy storm. But when the passions sort of course through an institution, an organism, an organization, so home, church, world, whatever it is, people basically they're led astray, right? The passions they blind us. They keep us from thinking clearly. They keep us from making wise decisions. There's an immediacy to them. And Friedman identified that as sort of the fundamental systemic problem in the West. And so I'm picking up that observation and saying, yep, the Bible talks about this. This isn't actually a new problem. Our technologies like social media may amplify it, but this thing's as old as dirt. And we see examples of it in the scriptures, and we ought to learn how to be grounded in order to resist those anxiety storms.
So there's the Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. And at the same time, it's probably accurate to say it sure feels elevated right now. It sure feels like the level of untethered emotion is all over the place. And not only that, but because it's that way, it's becoming normalized. in some ways where it's acceptable to do that. And to call it what it is actually puts a governor on it, actually stops people almost, and it's so offensive because it's so abrupt when they're used to the space to run around and emote about things.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I think that one difference is the way that terms like empathy, they get hijacked and valorized. They get elevated. But I also think at the same time, people have been wielding other people's emotions to sabotage and steer them forever. Right. So there is that nothing new under the sun. One difference is that we figured out how to monetize it with our algorithms. So, all social media algorithms are built on trying to either stoke your desire, your fear, or your outrage. Like that's they're appealing to the passion. So here they're going to show you either here's something titillating that you want, and so you have the pornography sort of stuff. Here's something that you want, and it's awakening envy, desire. That's one thing. Here's something scary. Here's the real scary stuff that's going on that you don't have any control over, and so now you're going to stew in that anxiety. Or here's something that your enemies are doing that's outrageous and is designed before you're angry, and that's what hooks you to the device. So we figured out how to refine and purify, not in a positive sense, but purify in a potency sense, right? To really dial those emotions up. But what they're working on is human nature, fallen human nature, which is prone to make provision for the flesh to gratify its passions.
That's well said. Emotional sabotage, to me, as I've read through the book, got it pretty quickly after it came out, and just that phrase, I find it to be really helpful. Wanting to watch out for not believing that someone with an honest critique is emotionally sabotaging me, but also just being mindful of the person may not always even know that this is what they're participating in. But when you can pastorally, hopefully, right? So not in a reactionary yourself, anger and passion sense, but name and identify what's going on. There's a value. There's a sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Like to name something. So when it comes to the church, what are some common expressions that you've done a lot of, I don't know, coaching calls or just pastoral work in your life in general? What are some common expressions of emotional sabotage churches are susceptible to these days?
Yeah, so the idea of sabotage, and the reason why that I think is a potent metaphor for what we're talking about is it allows for you to think of your institution. So say we're talking about a church here, has a purpose. It has a thing that it's meant to do, a divinely ordered purpose. God has given it the purpose, and God has provided heads, and in church's case, to be pastors, to lead the church and organize it and structure it for that purpose. That's what they're to do. Sabotage is the various ways that purpose is derailed. It's taken off. It's interrupted. It's kneecapped. It's steered. And I think that's one of the things is the idea of steering is a real prominent one. One of the things I think that the book has introduced into current discourse is this idea of being steered, where someone is basically trying to put a steering wheel on your back and steer you where they want to take you. And so in church context, it allows for a range of evaluations of individuals. So some people are doing it deliberately, like they know I'm going to get a steering wheel and I'm going to steer this place. So there's a kind of maliciousness or intentionality to it. Other people don't realize that they're being steered. So they're being steered, and therefore they're trying to steer you. So they don't know that they're innocent from in a malice perspective. They don't realize the way that they themselves are being steered, and therefore passing it on. And this is the way that kind of passions thing, it courses through a system. It works its way, say, from the world, which you may be immune to, but other people aren't. And so they launder that anxiety or that steering from person to person to person. So I've tried to think, maybe the AI art will get good at this, but you can enter the prompt into some of that AI art. But if you can imagine basically a group of people, each of which has a steering wheel on their back, and the person one step removed has their hand on that, and they don't realize it, but because that hand is on their back, they've got their hand on somebody else's, and everybody's trying to steer everybody. And what's the means that we use to do it? Well, we use our passions, right? And so some people blow up, as a way of dominating a conversation, right? You get really angry and you get your way. Other people shut down. I'm going to, throw a pity party and I get my way. And other people get really anxious, get really like fearful. And so people accommodate that. And so the passions, whatever the passions are then the thing, everybody's uncomfortable with the eruption of the passion. And so we'll do whatever it takes to avoid the blow up, to avoid setting it off. And that's how organizations come to, instead of being about the purpose that God gave them, to kind of be hijacked by the most, again, reactive, immature members of the community.
And there's so much overlap just in hearing that to the family too.
Right.
The dynamic of what do kids do? I mean, so it's kind of just an expression of an adult version of a kid meltdown in a sense.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, one of the funny things is kids are actually really honest about this.
Yeah, exactly.
So like I remember there've been times when one of my sons when he was younger was throwing a pity party. I'd say you're trying to throw a pity party right now to get me to do what you want, and he would be like, yes.
He's just admitting. Yeah,
and your kids are like, yeah, that's what I'm doing. Is it working? But the thing is we actually don't grow out of that. We frequently we just get better at masking it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we become really good at rationalizing, justifying, explaining away what we're doing. And we come up with all kinds of good reasons for why, no, I'm not throwing a pity party. I'm just telling the truth. When in reality, what's actually moving the needle, what's getting someone to get their way is the manipulation of their emotions by your own emotions. That fusion where the emotions kind of come together. And again, sometimes it's the sharing of the same emotion. So, getting alert to this. So sometimes somebody else is sad, they're hurt and they're suffering and they're in pain. And so you join them in their pain. So you feel bad too. Other times though, it's they're suffering and it makes you angry at the person who made them suffer. And so their sadness produces anger in you. This is the thing Lewis is talking about with pity for one person leads to anger for a different person, which leads to cruelty towards the oppressor. Okay. And sometimes that, if it's tethered and governed, that could be appropriate. You could actually pursue biblical justice, right? Here's someone who's been deeply harmed by another person and we want justice. And it's all tethered and it's all well and good. Other times though, it's actually blinding and concerns of justice go out the window because our identification with one person means another person isn't even on the radar. And that's what's funny about it is that this is how you explain the fact that some of the most empathetic people can be absolutely vitriolic and there's an empathetic rage. It's because it's selective. It's empathy for one person leads to hostility to another. Lots of global conflicts, I think, are actually explained that way, right? The other guy's atrocities justify our atrocities, and so that's why you get that phenomenon. And so that can happen again. Yeah, like you said, it can happen in homes, it happens in churches, happens among nations. So no one's immune because this is a human problem.
And if you add to that a skill or a gift in communication or writing and a big vocabulary, you get someone able to mask, to your point, what they're actually doing in just this giant word salad of descriptors and emoting and all of this. But man, people get so spun up oftentimes with trying to get through so much wordiness and maybe vagueness to actually, and this is what I appreciate about how concise your book is, all of 120 pages, right? But man, it packs a punch, and just getting straight to the center when it's so hard to do oftentimes.
Yeah, well, and I don't think I use this example in the book. I'm actually in the middle of trying to put together what I think will be a little follow-up book that'll be more on the compassion, empathy question. It'll expand. So chapter 3, I think, in the book is where I really do a brief version of the empathy stuff. And how that's a steering wheel. I'm going to try to expand that into its own, basically pulling together a lot of things I've written over the years on this subject. But one example of this that I think is it's a good illustration is I think it was last fall there was a political ad in like a governor's race somewhere in the country, and it was a Democratic ad against the Republican governor, and the video was of a young woman, probably 18 to 20, something like that, who basically said, I was raped by my stepfather and became pregnant. And so-and-so, the bad candidate, she thought this bad candidate, wants to take away my rights. Okay. And, and then at one point she said, And if he gets his way, women won't have any options. And that's unthinkable. And it was it was a deeply, it was an appeal to compassion, right? The idea is, look, here's a young woman who, when she was younger, was raped and assaulted by a wicked man. And it's meant to awaken your pity, your compassion for her. But then that compassion for her is used to deny any compassion for her unborn child, right? Which is then dispensed with under the euphemism of options. So it's obfuscating, it's masking the reality, right? So should she have compassion? Should we have compassion for her? Absolutely. Should we have compassion for the unborn child? Absolutely. But the intensity of the compassion for one leads us to ignore the other. One of these people is a worthy object of compassion, and one isn't. The other one can just be denied. And this is how that manipulative empathy works. The makers of that ad knew what they were doing. She's sitting there, and you're seeing her. The unborn baby is in a trash can somewhere.
Mm. Yeah, it's the idea too, and you've talked about this as well, but just how nuance gets perverted.
Right.
Where
Exactly.
yeah, there's a side in which that side is allowed to speak into something and to clarify, but the other side's not able to. One side is enforced, and you're manipulated to go this way, where this other side is completely neglected, and it can frame something entirely inaccurately and perversely in that sense too.
That's right. So, and the common thread there is the selectivity. So it's the selective empathy, right? For, in this case, the young woman, the abused woman, and it's selective. She gets it, the unborn baby doesn't.
Right.
Similarly, with nuance, the way that nuance in and of itself, just like compassion or pity, is a good thing, but oftentimes it's selectively applied, right? It's nuance. Frequently it's nuance left and then punch right.
Yeah.
Right. Like that, like the common dynamic that people began to get wise to is that certain people, it would be really, we talk about the complexities and the nuances of things. And well, you have to understand that the reason they're so zealous for this issue is because they have this in their background, or the historic injustices perpetrated mean that we have to take that into account, all of which may have been fine if it was applied in an equal weights and measures sort of way. But it often wasn't. It was often, again, part of that steering wheel mechanism. Is we're gonna nuance one way, and that moves the Overton window left, while being as we're fully capable of rebuking sins, but there all happen to be certain kinds of sins, and they all happen to be certain sins that are we can rebuke sharply things that the world wants us to rebuke.
Yes.
But things that the world doesn't want us to rebuke, all of a sudden it's time for nuance. And so this was, again, a part of that manipulative mechanism that was in play. It was a steering wheel. And often that one was accompanied, this is the other thing I talk about in the book, is the way that labels, accusations, were steering wheels. So basically, if the world could slap a label on you, a negative label, you're a racist, you're a misogynist, you're an enabler of abuse, all of these things, people have such an aversion. I don't want to be called names. I don't want people to think that I'm that sort of person. I'm not. And so the labels are an attempt to get the steering wheel on your back, because once they figured out what label you will go to great lengths to avoid, then they can just turn you wherever they want. And this is a phenomenon that isn't simply, the obvious examples are ones that would steer us sort of left in a progressive direction, but it could happen to the right. There's things that certain Christians in their circles wouldn't want to be called. If you got called woke by someone,
sure,
right, that could simply be just another version of the steering wheel. Because in both, and what makes it a steering wheel is it doesn't matter whether it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The truth of the accusation is irrelevant to, I just want to avoid the accusation. I don't want to have that applied to me. Whereas in the other case, the truth of it would be the fundamental question. Well, let's see. If it's true, then we ought to repent. If it's a real sin and it's true, we ought to repent of it. If it's not true, we ought to not care. Right? In fact, Jesus says, if it's false, you ought to rejoice. This is a time for rejoicing. Congratulations, you've got a promotion. They're uttering false things about you. Jesus says you're blessed. That's what they did to the prophets. They called, Elijah's a troubler of Israel. He got called names falsely. And so Jesus was called names. John the Baptist was called names. All of these demonic, he's a drunkard, he's a glutton. All of these names, congratulations, you're getting called names that aren't true. Welcome to the club. You're in good company.
Mm-hmm.
And so that should be our response, not how do I avoid it at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
One of the just another core idea that shows up early in the book, but I know goes throughout, is this notion of sober-mindedness. And you define sober-mindedness as a clarity of mind, a stability of soul, and a readiness to act. Maybe pick either one. I'm thinking of either like fathers or of pastors.
Yeah.
Maybe address one of those leadership positions, if you will, regarding the need for sober-mindedness in our day and age.
Right. So, let's go to the home. We talked a little bit about the church, but in the home, oftentimes, dad is called to everything in the home is his responsibility, even though everything in the home is not his fault. So he's
Right.
responsible for the whole thing, even though there's other sinners who can sin and he's not to blame for what they did, but he is to blame for what he did, which could include abdication. And so frequently, if you've got emotional tangles in your home, you've got kids that are acting out, or your wife is upset about something, the fundamental thing you need in order to address it is a kind of groundedness, right? You need to have, this is again the don't be empathetic. You need to have your feet planted on something outside of the system, outside of the home, right? Like on Jesus. You need to be clinging to him. And then because of that, you have some stability, and now you can enter in to a fraught emotional situation where you've got conflict, maybe sibling rivalries and conflicts that are spilling over, or disrespect to mom, or disrespect to you, or whatever the particulars might be. Your ability to deal with that is dependent upon you not getting sucked into the system and becoming one more emotional domino that gets falling. In the book, I talk about one of the fundamental virtues for a dad, I think, that is curiosity. You've got to be able, and curiosity means you have to be able to step out of that reactive environment and ask some questions of, where did that come from? Why did my son respond to me in that way? Why did my wife get so angry at that comment? What's going on here? But that requires a groundedness so that their agitation doesn't spill over to you. And frequently when leadership goes wrong, it's here you have strong emotion that hits you and you just send it back into the system louder. Right? You just amplify it. So the frustration of the family hits you, and then you blow up or you shut down. And that's just sending it back into the system. And it's just going to churn there even more. And now the whole group's being led by their passions. And you want to be the place where the passions come, and it's like they hit, it's like a wave crashing on a beach, right? They hit the rocks and then they dissipate, because you can handle that emotion and you can go, let's get behind it. I'm not offended. I want to understand. This is the where I'd point to something like 1 Peter 3, live with your wife in an understanding way. Live with your wife. In other words, showing honor to her as the weaker vessel. I'm not I'm trying to understand where she's coming from. I want to understand where my kids, what's going on back there, not so that then I can go, okay, now I know, but so that I can address it wisely. I can act with courage. I can act with compassion. I can act with wisdom to address the real issue and not just get tossed by the swirl of emotion.
Yeah, it's very very helpful. You're right. Speaking of the family again, about husbands needing gravity. The quote is, like a planet with its moon, a husband guides his home through gravity. I've appreciated that picture, as well as what I think is really important to recognize. Out of Ephesians 5, it's not just that we should tell men they should be the head of the household, but that you are. It's a statement of reality. It's a part of a husband's identity, core duty. You either do it well or you fail, you abdicate in it, right? So that idea of gravity, what should the picture of gravity kind of compel men toward in terms of taking up that God-given role, husband and father?
Yeah, so gravity is a function largely of competence and confidence. So, my friend Michael Foster's written a great book, It's Good to Be a Man, and he talks about cultivating gravitas by competence in various ways. So that's both, in your vocation or something, but also relational competence, right? Being able, how do you navigate relationships and emotions and things like that? There's a competence, it's a skill, you have to cultivate it. But then also that confidence that comes from that, where there's a sense in which I know who I am, right? I know what God says about me. I know what God says I'm to do. I know what I am, not just what I ought to be, but I know what I am. And because I know what I am, I know what he's calling me to do. And that gives me a kind of purposiveness and directiveness. I'm doing this, and I'm pulling others into my orbit as I go to do it, as we go to do it. I'm the leader, but I'm leading not by maybe one way to put it is oftentimes when people feel like they have to yell, it's a sign that they know intuitively that they don't have gravity. Like a dad who has to raise his voice, no, at that moment is communicating, I don't have, my gravity is insufficient. I'm lacking gravity. And so I'm going to compensate for the lack of gravity by elevated voice. And there's a variety of different ways that you can do that. Women don't necessarily raise the voice. They could do that, but they often will manipulate, right? An attempt to manipulate would be the way there's an absence of, I can't win the argument. And so I'm going to try something other than argument. I'm going to try something other than persuasion. I'm going to leverage emotion. And so again, that's a kind of that steering idea coming into play. So a husband, part of what he needs to do is he needs to pay attention to his own reactions. Where does he get his dander up? When does he feel like his frustration is rising or his anxiety? When does he feel like he's avoiding things? Learning to recognize often is those are the places where you actually need to lean in. Those are the things where you have to overcome that reluctance and press into it with gravity, with sober-mindedness. And then I would say the other counterpart to that is gladness. I think this is really important because it's actually one of, and they go together, because one of the things that gives you gravity is gratitude and joy. Like glad-heartedness, a dad's glad-heartedness is an anchor for his family. It's something that it's reassuring. It gives them confidence. This is, I learned this from Lewis. And so, to be first in, last out, laughing loudest is from The Horse and His Boy is a fundamental thing that leaders need to do. And the laugh louder is it's a scanty meal. Things are hard. I'm not sure what's going to do, but I'm trusting God. And therefore I'm able to put on the brave face and laugh loudest in the face of hardship, which is what your family needs in that moment. They need to know Dad's trusting God. Dad's trusting God. And Dad has a plan. Dad's going to do something. So whatever the action is, he's not abdicating. He's not blame shifting. He's not falling down on the job. He's leaning in with gravity and gladness.
That's so good.
Yeah.
So then you think about getting out of the doors of your home, getting into the world, and taking that gravitas into the world, having courage in the world. It's the spillover of doing that, right? In the home and in your local church, and then out the door, scattering on mission to be lights in the world, and to not be controlled by the tyranny of all of these steering pressures that people want to place on you. And they take different forms as you enter into the world in your various contexts. But that courage piece is spillover from establishing it right in your own house.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. Yeah. So just like Paul says that your fundamental qualification, one of them for ministry, is can you manage your household well? Which I think is what we're getting at with that family discussion. It's do you lead with gravity and gladness in your home such that your family is well ordered? And if you can't do it there, you shouldn't do it in the church. You got to start with the little one before you can move up to the big one. You got to be faithful in little before you can be put over much. And then the same thing would be true is, okay, now you're faithful a step out. Now you move out into the world with God's blessing, right? So you and you've practiced. You know how to maintain your composure, to maintain your sober-mindedness in the face of hardship and pain and suffering and emotion in your own home. And so now you're well equipped to go do it out in the world. And actually, like, this is important because sometimes it's actually easier to do it in relation to the world than it is doing it in relation to your home. Some guys excel, right? They can be really courageous out there, but really struggle to be sober-minded in the face of their own homes. And getting the order right is essential for longevity and for faithfulness over generations.
That's a good point.
Well, Joe, so much has already been covered, and we can't thank you enough for the time today. I think our listeners will be richly blessed by this. Just again, the name of the book, and to encourage folks to run out and get it, is Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. I know it can be bought on Canon Press. It can be bought on Amazon. You've got more and more coming out on the Canon Plus app right now as well. Just to plug a secondary book, I listened to. I believe this is a shorter book of a previously longer book, but Strangely Bright. Got the chance to listen to that. Just the enjoyment of God's good gifts in a godly way, in this rich world that He's given. I got to tell you, it was just stirring up in my own soul in a number of ways. And so appreciate you. Your work with C.S. Lewis material is robust as well.
And just the generosity, you
yeah.
know, your generosity with what you're doing and the books that you're writing. You know, we got copies into the hands of all of our interns, our pastoral interns that are being trained up in our church, and just deeply grateful for not only that you're writing, but that you guys are so generous in the way that you give it away, and you want to see this help shape the future generation for faithfulness.
Yeah, appreciate that, guys. Yeah, it's a blessing. I'm grateful. I'm hopeful that it'll run. The word will run and be honored.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you, listeners. As we always want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this, whether it's episodes from Scott and I or interviews with those like Dr. Rigney. It's a joy to have this outlet to continue to equip you in your own discipleship and growth and sanctification. Appreciate you taking the time to give a rating to Doxalogic, to give a review. That always helps, and continue to spread the word. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you soon.
You've been listening to Doxalogic, a podcast by Doxa Church in Rocklin, California. To learn more, visit us online at doxa.church.